In our third lesson in the narrative of African American history, we are going to look at roughly the 300 years that African Americans lived in North America before the United States gained independence from Great Britain. So during this time, the culture of slavery will expand and grow and become an integral part of the colonial economy. Our lesson objectives for this lesson: we are going to analyze the development of African American servitude in the Chesapeake region, which is Virginia and Maryland area. We're going to describe the characteristics of plantation slavery as it existed from 1700 to 1750. We're going to explain the factors that affected the way slaves lived in early America. We will compare and contrast slavery in the northern colonies with slavery in the southern colonies. And we will compare and contrast the African American experience under French and Spanish rule in North America with the African American experience under British rule. We will describe African American life in the northern borderlands of New Spain. We'll explain how slavery affected African American women in colonial America. And then we will describe ways in which African Americans resisted slavery. So, a lot in this lesson. Whenever the Europeans started to colonize the New World, as we know, there's going to be Native Americans that already live and thrive on the continent. They lived in distinct, diverse societies when the Europeans arrived. Once the Europeans showed up, as we learned in our last lesson, they're going to be weakened by disease that was brought by those Europeans. And so then they weren't able to resist when the British settlers come in the Chesapeake region, for example. It's also going to influence the way people of African and European descent come to live in North America. You are always going to see components of interactions with Native Americans and white colonists, slaves, different groups. For the Spanish, French, and Dutch, they didn't focus as much on settlement and creating those long-term colonies. They were more interested in trade and profit. So they had enslaved Africans, but just not at the level of the British colonies where you had farms and plantations and vast settlements. During this time, the first successful British colony that will be founded will be in Jamestown, Virginia. It's founded in 1607. The original purpose of this colony was, again, to make money. They tried to look for gold. They tried to do some other things without thinking of basic survival. The colony almost didn't survive. And once they finally got established, the main reason they did survive is they realized that they could plant tobacco in this area and they could really profit off of it. And so in this first colony in Jamestown, they're mostly going to use white laborers to farm the tobacco up until 1700. Our first group of Africans to arrive in the Chesapeake area, which is where our first colony is founded, will happen in 1619. So by 1619, there were 32 people of African descent living in Jamestown. Not a lot is known about when they arrived or where they came from, and they were all in the service of planters. And so this group, they became servants, and they were considered quote unquote unfree, but not slaves yet. And the main reason that happens is there wasn't really a law in place yet to establish rules for slavery, if you will, in the British Empire. So that will eventually change. Once this initial group worked off their purchase price, they regained their freedom. Many of them even came to own land. Some of them convert to Christianity and become parts of the Church of England. So they had more opportunity than later groups of Africans that came in. Africans will be a small minority in this area till around 1700. Around this time, there are going to be about 300 Africans in the area, as opposed to 18,500 Europeans. The English are also going to follow the Spanish example, calling the Africans Negroes, meaning Negro meaning black in Spanish. Um, the population will remain small, and even in the neighboring colony of Maryland in this time period, they will only account for about 3% of Maryland's population. So these first Africans worked as indentured servants. So usually for an indentured servant, and this would be of any race, they would work for perhaps a debt. For Europeans that wanted to come to the New World and they couldn't afford it, someone might pay their pay for them to come to the New World, and to pay them back, they would work as an indentured servant for a number of years, and then they were freed and they had the same rights as those that they lived around. So this was how it first started with the first Africans that came to the Chesapeake region. So during the 1600s, the opinions of treatment of African Americans did evolve into what becomes the norm, which is chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is a form of slavery in which enslaved are treated legally as property. So they were seen as the same as their livestock, as a bulk of crop, piece of land. This is where slavery evolves to. By 1671, Africans are about 5% of the Virginia population, and then by 1700, they're about 20% of the population. Britain does end up gaining more control of the slave trade. Remember that asiento we talked about in the last chapter, the contract? And as they got more control of the slave trade, slaves became less costly and more appealing for colonists to purchase. The English often distinguished between how they treated each other and how they treated those who were different physically and culturally from them. And so this is where we will see that difference in treatment of African Americans versus those that are of Anglican or English descent. Around the 1640s, you will start to see different courts in the colonies assume that it is permissible for those of African descent to serve their master for life. Before this time frame, you didn't really have that spelled out, that you were a slave for life. And then around the 1640s, you start to see in some of the colonial documentation that, yes, somebody that is purchased as a slave is purchased for life. So as we get further into colonial life, we will see in legal documents, statute books that will they will bring up more aspects of chattel slavery in this area. We will see bills of sale that will stipulate that the children of black female servants would also be servants for life. We will see in the mid 1660s that there's this assumption that servitude is the natural condition of African Americans. And during this time is whenever we start to see what they call the slave codes that are enacted. And these are often put in place to define American slavery as a system that sought to control people of African descent so that they could exploit their labor. So some examples of slave codes that come out is a slave could not testify against a white person in court. They could not own property. They could not leave their master's estate without a pass. Slaves could not gather in groups of larger than 3 or 4. They could not marry. They couldn't bear arms. Another slave code that is seen in 1669 is if a master kills their slave while giving a punishment, such as whipping, then felony charges were not brought against them. So the legal recognition of chattel slavery will evolve in the colonies in the 1600s. For example, in 1662, the House of Burgesses will decree that a child's condition, whether free or unfree, will follow that of its mother. In the mid-1660s, you'll see statutes that will assume that servitude is a natural condition of African Americans. We also will start to see slave codes that are enacted from 1660 to 1710. And these are going to end up defining the American slavery as a system that was sought to control people of African descent and to exploit their labor. So, some examples of the slave codes that we'll see is slaves could not testify against white people in court, they couldn't own property, they couldn't leave their master's estate without a pass, they couldn't gather in groups larger than three or four, they couldn't marry or bear arms. Another example of a slave code from 1669 is that if a master kills a slave while administering a punishment, such as whipping, there were no charges held against that master. Another small, like what we usually see as a small event in colonial history, is going to be a huge event in the evolution of American slavery, and that's going to be Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion, it starts with Bacon, who is an English aristocrat. He had recently migrated to Virginia, and the main reason for his rebellion is he has a disagreement over a Native American policy with the governor at the time. Bacon represented the frontier areas. He wanted to attack and kill the Native Americans that were nearby. The governor, who made a lot of money from his trade with Native Americans, he refused to go along and approve of these attacks. So when this happens, there are quite a few white indentured servants and former indentured servants and African American slaves that join in the rebellion. So this suggested that the poor white and African American people had a chance to unite against the planter elite, against those that were the rich white planters. So before this alliance could ever be realized, Bacon does die from disease and his rebellion collapses. But what really comes out of this is that the colony's elite, that planter elite, they see that if they continue to rely on white laborers, they end up becoming free and they get guns and that becomes dangerous. And then it comes to a where they deal with almost a social class issue. So when they move towards full reliance on a black slave labor force, the planters do this assuming that those slaves will never become free and never, therefore, get firearms, and this would avoid that class conflict among white people. So, after this rebellion, people wanted to keep those of African descent, denying their freedom, keeping them in a place where they could not take up arms and could move into a rebellion and work with the poor or the white labor force. And so this is going to change it from relying on white laborers to an African American labor force in slavery. So now let's look at plantation slavery from 1700 to 1750. By 1750, over 144,000 slaves live in Virginia and Maryland. This will be about 61% of all slaves in British North America. Another 40,000, or 17% of slaves, will be in South Carolina and Georgia. At this time, most white Southerners did not own slaves, yet the economic development of the area really depended on that slave labor. Many worked on small farms with less than 5 slaves. Others were on large farms and plantations. Before 1750, nearly all of the slaves worked in the fields. They worked sunup to sundown with breaks for food and rest. After 1750, you started to see more skilled occupations. You started to see women working as domestic servants when they were not in the fields. Now we're going to look specifically at a region that's known as the Low Country and how slavery went there, because it was a little different than the Chesapeake or up north. So the Low Country is going to be the coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia. And this area, the first British settlers go to Charleston, and they mostly came from the island of Barbados. Many of these settlers were slaveholders in Barbados, and they brought their slaves with them. The laborers of African descent were never indentured servants. They arrived in this chattel slavery situation where they're slaves for life. By the early 1700s, at this time, you had African Americans and Native Americans that were part of the slave population. A quarter of them were Native Americans. By 1700s, the planters in this area began concentrating and growing on rice. The climate and the landscape was more conducive to what you need to be successful in growing rice. This is going to lead to really large plantations in the area. making massive profits, hundreds of slaves on a plantation. By 1740, 90% of the population around Charleston were slaves. In the 1750s, this rice cultivation and slavery will spread to Georgia. And by 1773, you're going to have about an equal distribution of population between white people and slaves. Now, work on the plantations and in this area did have higher mortality rates than up north, usually from disease, from overwork, and poor treatment. Rice cultivation is a very labor intensive job. And even in this area, you're going to have distinct classes that will emerge between different people of color in this area. So, slavery life in early America, we don't have a lot of evidence of what the individual lives of slaves were like, mainly because slaves were illiterate. They weren't allowed to learn how to read or write, so there wasn't a way to write down or make accounts of what their life was like. We do know that their housing was very minimal, often temporary. For example, in the Chesapeake area, it was made of log cabins. They had dirt floors, brick fireplaces, wooden chimneys, and very few, if any, windows. Clothing was also pretty minimal at this time, and usually you got men might wear breechcloths, women had skirts. In the summer, children might even go naked until they reach puberty. Later, it did evolve where men would wear traditional shirts and trousers and hats while working in the fields. Women would wear shifts, which are like a loose, simple dress, and they would cover their heads. During the winter, they would get warmer clothing for that. Eventually, the African Americans are going to be able to retain a sense of personal style that was compatible with West African culture with their clothing. Food usually consisted of corn, yams, salt pork, occasionally salted beef or fish. Sometimes the slaves would catch fish or they would raise chickens and rabbits. And they would often supplement their meals with items that they grew in their own gardens in between their work time. Another aspect of life at this time is the concept of miscegenation and creolization. So miscegenation is interracial relationships that result in producing children or people of mixed race. Creoles, like we said in our last lesson, are people of African descent or European descent born in North America. And then another terminology that's going to come about in this time is the term mulatto. And mulatto are going to be those of mixed African and European ancestry. So we will see examples of interracial marriage at the beginning in colonial America. It will eventually be outlawed. When it is outlawed and they banned the mixed race marriages, the main purpose was to keep white women from bearing mulatto children. So they were fearing that if children of white mothers would try to sue for freedom, and it would kind of cause some class issues. The wealthy white people often feared that there was going to be a blur between dominant and subordinate races if there was this mixed race marriage. Now, there was no law in place to prevent white male masters from sexually exploiting slave women. So if a slave woman had a child that was a mulatto or mixed race, there wasn't a way to really prove who the father was. So that didn't end up being as much of an issue than if, say, a white woman had a child from an interracial marriage. So this class division evolves over time where, in the early 1600s, you might have seen mixed race marriages, but they will end up being outlawed. During this time, you're going to see a second generation of people of African descent living in America. So most of them might have lost their parents' native language or ethnic identity, but they still retain a generalized West African heritage and pass it on to their descendants. They keep notions of kinship, religious concepts and practices, African words and modes of expression, musical style and instruments, cooking methods and food, and folk literature and folk art. So, just like we had in West Africa, extended families are still going to be very important to African Americans. It's going to influence their naming practices. For example, male children may be named after close relatives. Their surnames or their last names are going to be taken from their master, but if they continue with a West African name, it's usually linked to a location. African names will be passed on despite slave owners giving classical or biblical names. Biblical names don't become common until the mid 1700s, and that's because before that time, masters refused to allow slaves to be converted to Christianity. African religions, such as indigenous religions and Islam, will persist well into the 1800s. We start to see a lot more African Americans converting to Christianity, and that's going to happen around the time of the Great Awakening, which was a big spiritual revival in the late 1700s, early 1800s. This widespread conversion to Christianity, it caused some fear for masters because they felt that converted slaves would interpret this new religious status as perhaps a step towards freedom and equality because they were now Christians like their masters. Slaves stay devoted to their ancestral religions, and some of them, Christianity just did not attract them. So we're also going to see, for a time, some more mutual acculturation between African Americans and white people as a result of the Great Awakening. So, although African Americans did not retain their ancestral language, they are going to they're going to learn, usually in the American colonies, learn English, but various dialects of English that might have, that were influenced by their ancestral languages. Music will be very essential to West African life. It's going to remain so in America. We're going to have the call and response style of singing, an emphasis on improvisation, complex rhythms, a strong beat. You're going to have different instruments such as the African banjo that will survive, and then also the use of the violin and the guitar. West African folk literature is also going to survive in America. We talked about this in the first chapter. Lots of tales, proverbs, and riddles, and usually those tales are going to portray, in the past in Africa, it was the common people and how they might outsmart their rulers. Now that's going to evolve to tales of slaves that might ridicule or outsmart their master. If you've ever read The Tale of Brer Rabbit, that's a good example of a tale that came from this time period. So now let's move on to the northern colonies. So slavery doesn't really thrive in the northern colonies. Our main reason is mostly climate. It really wasn't a conducive atmosphere for growing crops. They had shorter growing seasons, rocky soil. It just didn't make sense. So between religion, geography, climate, there were plenty of white laborers up north, and the economy was very diverse. They might have factories and shipping and other things that don't rely on agriculture. So there wasn't really a need as much for slaves. By the 1770s, African Americans will be about 4.5% of northern populations, but in the South, it'll be 40%. The ones that were in the North were mostly agricultural workers. Some of them worked in skilled trades. There were slave codes in New England, but they weren't as strict as the ones that were going to be in the middle colonies, and then those aren't as strict as the ones in the southern colonies. Slavery in this area was not as harsh as it was in the South. So there was that option to retain those African perspectives, and they were allowed to have a little bit more freedom, perhaps in their movement and their daily lives, than their southern counterparts. So now let's look at a comparison between slavery from British North America onto slavery in other colonies that were in North America at this time. So we're going to look at Spanish Florida, for example, and we're going to look at French Louisiana. So modern day Louisiana and Florida. So in these areas, language in Florida will be Spanish, French Louisiana will be French, and then in British North America it's English. The religion for the Spanish and French colonies is going to be Roman Catholic, whereas in British North America, you're looking at Protestant religions such as Episcopalian, Church of England. You might see Puritans, um, Presbyterian, Methodist, different groups like that. Most of the slaves in Spanish Florida are going to work as soldiers. In French Louisiana, they're going to be field workers. And then some in the city of New Orleans will become more artisans and have more skills. And then most of your slaves in British North America will also be field workers. The treatment of slaves in Spanish Florida, they did gain power as those soldiers, those militiamen. They even got some social status, and they were usually members of the Catholic Church. Most of your slaves in French Louisiana were in the port cities. They usually lived away from their masters and had a little bit of independence. They had a chance to gain freedom. Unfortunately, in this area, women were exploited often. In British North America, slaves were it was chattel slavery. There wasn't really a path to freedom. Once the British or the Americans take over Spanish Florida, people of African descent, a lot will retreat to Cuba, and then in this area, plantation slavery will grow. For slaves and African Americans in French Louisiana, they will not leave the colony and will eventually be absorbed into that southern plantation lifestyle. Other areas that will possibly have slavery is the New Spain's borderlands. So for those of us in Texas, this is going to be a lot of your Texas, northern Mexico, those regions. So the first people of African descent in these areas come with the conquistadors on their expeditions. Some in the 1600s will be part of the Spanish conquest of Pueblo Indians. Many will gain employment as sailors, soldiers, tradesmen, cattle herders, and day laborers. And there's more hereditary rank and racial fluidity that existed in the borderlands. One of the more famous African Americans that came through the Spanish borderlands and came through Texas is going to be Esteban. Esteban was an enslaved Moor, which would mean a Muslim of African descent. He's going to travel with Cabeza de Vaca on his journey. He survives a shipwreck on the Texas coast, and he's briefly held captive by Native Americans. He eventually joins a 7-year trek from Texas to Mexico with Cabeza de Vaca. He's a skilled interpreter, and he later explored the regions that are today New Mexico and Arizona. So he is a very interesting character when looking at African Americans in the Spanish borderlands. African American women in colonial America. In New England, there was more opportunity for some skilled trades, such as being a baker or a weaver. There was, other opportunities up north. There weren't many opportunities in the South beyond the fields and the homes of their masters. Late 1600s, early 1700s, most women worked in the fields. In the 1700s, more became house servants, and some would even be the wet nurse for the slave owners' children, meaning that they would breastfeed the children. And African American women in this time didn't have much medical care. So if an African American woman was pregnant, there wasn't much in terms of prenatal care, and you were expected to work in the fields up until the birth. You weren't really given much time to rest. And so because of this, you're going to have pretty high infant mortality rate. You're going to have a high death rate for women given in childbirth as a result of this inadequate medical attention. Unfortunately, many African American women, African American slave women, were also victims of sexual exploitation mostly from their owners. So, a common question with slavery in North America is why didn't more slaves rebel? There was quite a bit of resistance as opposed to open rebellion. You have to remember that slavery in America it relied ultimately on physical force to deny freedom to African Americans. So, resistance had to come from in a different way. So, resistance might be shirking your work duties, perhaps accidentally breaking a tool or items. Um, so, something that was kind of seen as passive. And then you had more open forms such as escape and rebellion. So before the 1700s, there was resistance and rebellion, it was usually for a slave to help themselves, their friends and family, and then later it became aimed at destroying slavery as a whole system. Newly arrived Africans would openly defy their masters. This usually was a reason why many slave owners preferred slaves that were seasoned. And sometimes to avoid punishment, because the punishment could be extremely harsh. Slaves were often, they would do kind of day to day obstruction. And again, that passive resistance where you couldn't really put the blame on one individual and punishment on one individual, but it would get in the way of the progress of where they lived. Rebellions were even more rare than resistance and escape. The larger proportion of slaves in a population, the more likely they were to rebel. They had a chance to gather and discuss and make plans. So the areas in around South Carolina where 90% were slaves might have a higher chance of rebellion than, say, up in New England. So two of the more notable rebellions, one is going to be in New York City in 1712. And this one, 27 Africans they set fire to an outbuilding. When the white men arrived to put out the blaze, the rebels attacked them with muskets, hatchets, and swords. They killed 9 white men and wounded 6. So after this, a local militia will capture the rebels. 6 of the rebels did commit suicide. The other 21 were executed. Some of them were pretty brutal. The next rebellion of example is going to be the Stono Rebellion in 1739. This is about 20 miles from Charleston. And so under the leadership of a man named either Jimmy or Tommy, they're not sure, about 20 slaves who had recently arrived from Africa are going to break into a warehouse and get guns and ammunition. They kill the warehouseman and they flee towards Florida. Other slaves will join this group until the number reaches about 100. They sacked plantations. They killed approximately 30 more white people. But when they stopped to celebrate their victories and to beat drums to attract other slaves, the planters on horseback that were aided by local Native Americans surrounded them, killed 44 of them, and dispersed the rest. Many of the rebels, including the leader, remained at large for up to 3 years. And eventually, in Charleston, authorities arrested 150 slaves, and they hanged 10 daily to cut down that spirit of hoping to rebel. So, rebellion didn't turn into success. So, to sum up our chapter on 300 years of African Americans in colonial North America, we looked at how slavery evolved from the first group that arrived in the Chesapeake in 1619 and how it evolved into what became chattel slavery. We looked at the difference between slavery in the northern colonies and the southern colonies. We looked at slavery between the French, the Spanish, and the British. We looked at African American life in the borderlands, and then how slavery affected women and ways in which African Americans resisted slavery.